welcome back to another exciting episode of Natural 20. I am your host, as always, Joseph Newell. And here on this podcast, we talk about role-playing games for beginners. Let's fun it up. We have a very exciting show planned here for you guys today. For our expert hearsay segment, we're going to be talking about Koibu's Corner with YouTube's Koibu, where he shares some advice to players that has caused a lot of controversy recently. We're going to be talking about Dungeon World in our product review, and then in Brainstorm, we're going to be discussing about how to play a game with only 2 people. I'm very excited for this show, you guys. Let's get it started. Welcome to Expert Hearsay. Today we're going to be talking about Koibu's Corner. Koibu, aka Neil Erickson, was the original DM for itmejp's roleplay series, DM Classic, if you will. He has gained a reputation for being meticulous, brutal, and a D&D rules wizard. Koibu's Corner is his series where he talks about tips mostly for players. And today, we're going to be talking about his second episode in the series, which is titled Player Risk. In this episode, Koibu says that D&D is a game of risk inherently. He says that if players take it safe by explicitly avoiding any risk or danger, then everyone gets frustrated and bored, and neither the DM nor the players have any fun. He gives the example of a party having to make their way to a distant town, and the closest way through is to go through this spooky haunted graveyard. Woo! And the players decide, you know what? We really like our characters. We don't want to throw them into danger. Let's go around the hills to the east and come around the other side of the town and avoid the graveyard altogether. Ha 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 ha. Well, Koibu, he says that that's really boring. Now, he says that the alternative is that they go through the graveyard and have any number of solutions to the problem that gets presented. You know, it could be that there's a zombie infestation, in which case, you know, maybe their horses run way faster than the zombies and they can just run straight through. Maybe if there's like a ghost king haunting the graveyard, then they could reunite him with the spirit of his beloved who he killed in a jealous rage. Basically he says there's any number of things they could do that could lead to really fun adventures, but because they took the boring way, you know, all these fun things are not going to happen. Now, he also says that if the players take the fun risks, then the DM is going to be a lot more gracious and a lot more willing to help them out when things get rough. You know, maybe trying to find that extra +1 for them wherever he can. Now, these comments have drawn quite a lot of controversy from the internet. People are raging all over YouTube saying that they feel like Koibu is encouraging railroading, which is one of the cardinal sins of DMing. Railroading is where a DM, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, where the DM doesn't allow the players to really make any actions. You know, he says, okay, you have option A or option B, instead of saying, here's a situation, what do you do? You see that difference there? That difference in ability to create a story that the player wants to? So, railroading is very heavily looked down upon, and with pretty good reason. Now, personally, I can see the reasons for a lot of these complaints. On the surface, it could seem like he is trying to say, don't do what you want, players, do what the DM wants you to do and go with his story because it's going to be more fun. However, I don't really feel like that's what he was actually trying to say. Let me give you an example from one of my family's games that I was running recently. We are running Numenera, which is a science fantasy setting, a billion years in the future where there's technology so advanced it might as well be magic, right? But the trick is that a lot of this technology has been lost through various apocalypses, and now civilization is just kind of getting on its feet again, and yet it still has all this crazy stuff all over the place that it doesn't understand. So my party was going through this underground mountain area in this big vessel, and they made it to the last room of this dungeon. Now, it's worth noting that this is a pre-made dungeon. This is not something that I came up with. This is something that's in a Numenera core rulebook. So, by its very nature, due to it being a pre-written adventure, they naturally can't be as open with it as maybe people would like, because they have to accommodate for a lot of different things, and they have to present a story which a new DM and new players can follow and understand. So, in this last room, in this underground structure, there's a giant tentacle monster perched atop a big orange tank with these extra-dimensional creatures floating around it. Inside this orange goo inside this tank, which is leaking all over the place. Now, that's all the book describes. I personally added on that was kind of like a forklift thingy, that it had a truck cab on the front of it and that it was a hover vehicle, because I had certain plans for the players that I think could have been a cool way for them to escape. Now, mind you, I prepared all this a long time before I had learned a lot of the things that I discuss in this podcast. And you can see how practice really makes perfect. Because honestly, that's not a really good way to do things. But that's the way I did it. And the thing that happened really interests me and applies to this topic quite a bit. The players went through, they were supposed to fight this big nasty boss monster. In the first round, he grabbed like 3 of them and stunned them, and they couldn't do anything. And he could do that every turn, and I was getting really worried he may have been too powerful. And then one of the players did something very clever. He can psionically influence and take control of things, but if the action that the creature would take would lead them to harm, it's a lot harder for him to do. And this was a high-level creature, so he wouldn't have been able to do it normally, but he used a very clever item that made the creature very susceptible to psychic suggestion. And then he rolled really well and got the thing to lay down. And then they just walked up and stabbed it. And it was really cool. And it helped the players feel awesome. It helped that one player specifically feel like, hey, this stuff that I never thought was going to apply to anything actually ended up saving our butts. But then, more importantly, later on, they get to this tank and they patch up the holes and get it all working, and they were about ready to head back into town when they were ambushed by this legendarily powerful character and a couple of his lackeys. This was an invention of my own, based on, some complicated circumstances that have happened with the characters, and he wanted to take one of the characters and bring him to a neighboring kingdom for a bounty. Well, what I expected the players to do was to jump into the truck and drive off down the tunnels and escape, and everything would be awesome, and it would be a really cool escape scene. But they didn't do what I thought they would. The guy that had the bounty placed on him, he charged the legendary strong dude, and he ran right into his giant hammer and flew back about 20 feet. And it became pretty clear to everybody that this was a fight they were not going to win. So then I thought, okay, for sure, they're gonna get in the truck cab and they're gonna drive off. No, one person got in the truck cab, turned it on, and drove the pool of extra-dimensional liquid straight at this guy and his lackeys. That's a risk. This liquid was stuff that had been causing these wild temperature fluctuations, possibly killing lots of people. It's extremely acidic. They took a very interesting and unique risk that I didn't see coming. And because of that, I was really on their side because I thought that's a really cool idea. I want to see what happens. So I decided, yes, that's going to hit all 3 of the guys, and it's going to do some massive damage and everything, and it's going to be really awesome. It'll give you guys time to escape. So after some really lucky rolls, they drove that thing into the guys, and it capsized over. The person that was driving it dived out as it was driving along, slams into the guys, and the acid starts spilling out everywhere. The 2 lackey guys get dissolved immediately, and the other big guy is knocked out, encased in this suit of armor, and they see at the bottom of this, forklift thing is a giant portal leading into this extra-dimensional ocean-looking thing with all these flora and fauna swimming around, and this orange liquid is just pouring out of there. And then the players retreat into this tunnel that the giant tentacle creature supposedly made, and they start running up there. Now, that was a very interesting and fun play session. That wasn't I have this thing planned, I want you to do it. But they took risks inside of a situation that they wanted to make. And because they were taking interesting actions that was moving a story along, that was being interesting, I was definitely on their side and willing to give them a couple of extra things here or there. I feel like this really exemplifies what Koibu was talking about. Players take risks that they want to, making the actions that they want. Once again, it's all about preserving the player's agency, not fighting against it, but encouraging them to take actions instead of passively moving through a storyline without having any interesting or meaningful encounters. Product review. Alright everybody, today we're going to be talking about Dungeon World. Dungeon World is written by Adam Koebel. According to its website, it is, quote, a game of fantastic adventure, a game of magic, gods, demons, good and evil. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about Dungeon World. Starting off, when you start reading the rulebook, you'll start to see that it is very simple. There are not a lot of rules to confuse or to lose track of. You don't have to worry about 8 different saving throws. You don't need to worry about 100 different skills. It's all pretty streamlined. And that allows for new players to come in very quickly and easily, get a character up and running, and have a very traditional, simplified D&D experience. Now I say simplified, but really what I mean by that is that the focus isn't on the mechanics of the game. It isn't all about, how good of a die roll you can get and manipulating each situation to be able to get the most possible bonuses and everything. It's not so much about the mechanics as it is about the narrative. And its mechanics, the way that the game operates, its rules, help reinforce the DM and the players working together to create an interesting narrative. One way that it really changes a DM's role, usually you've got the DM and the players talk amongst themselves and say what they're going to do, and then tell the DM, hey, we're going to do this. And then the DM describes what happens. And as players are entering a new scene, the DM explains what's happening there and stuff like that. But in all cases, the DM is usually pretty passive. Dungeon World takes that and kind of flips it on its head. It says, a DM is truly a player, and they really show that through the rules. Instead of just saying, hey, this happens or that happens, the DM actually has a list of moves that he can do for his monsters. So let's say the players are fighting a giant dragon. He could spend 3 of his DM moves points and do a move that will separate the party from each other. And then the DM would describe, the dragon flies up on its wings and then dive bombs to the earth, separating the fighter from the cleric. It could be that he spends 2 points to do a massive breath flame attack against the entire party. It really quantifies a lot of things that a DM can do in any given situation. And in that sense, it carries over a lot of interesting principles from Numenera, which I really like. Numenera has a system called GM intrusions, where a GM can say, all right, you're going through the corridor and a GM intrusion, you fall in a spike pit. Make a roll to see if you manage to grab onto the edge of the cliff or not. Now the player can then decide, I want to accept this GM intrusion, and if I do so, I gain 1 experience point. But if I decide this is too bad, then I reject it by spending 1 experience point. So that makes some interesting decisions for the player. But it also gives the GM an opportunity and the right mechanics to be able to introduce complications into the living narrative of a role-playing game. And that's something that I really appreciate. It's a way to bring in these troubles, nuisances, problems, threats in a very organic and natural way that the players understand, okay, this is part of the game. It's not just the DM trying to kill my character. It's because this is what the game says to do, and it's gonna help us have fun. Now, Dungeon World is highly narrative. It doesn't focus a lot on the mechanics. What that means is it's really trying to tell a story. So, to say that the enjoyment that people get out of mechanics-based games, these systems-based games, is to say that they really enjoy the idea of beating the game. They really enjoy, messing around with all their stats, plotting out the progression of their character, figuring everything out that they need to in order to get the most possible bonuses in order to get past the next scenario and look stylish while they're doing it. That's the point, is I am so smart that I was able to outdo all these challenges set forth. A narrative-based game is much more around the idea of, we want to tell a fun story, share a couple of laughs, have some fun moments. We don't really care if we win or lose all that much. We don't care about, if we wear the belt of giant strength as opposed to the gloves of swashbuckling, we'll get an overall better average damage. It's not what that's about. The narrative games are, hey, this is fun, I want to do it. An example of how narrative-driven Dungeon World is, there is no turn order in combat. There's no initiative rolls of any sort. It's all just, I want to do this, and then you do it. There is no real order. So, that's interesting. Dungeon World really claims that it focuses on less prep time for the GM and a more direct interaction between the players. And that's one of the great strengths of RPGs. And it's one of the great pitfalls of RPGs when you only have 2 people that want to play, let's say. Because a lot of times, you'll have interested parties that really want to play a game together, but they can't seem to find anybody else that their schedule works into it, or they really have the desire to. So, this is really cool because when you only have 2 people, that great strength is gone. You don't have that whole party to interact with and bounce ideas off of, because the GM takes such a passive role. In Dungeon World, the DM has a more active role in the narrative, much more than describing the background. He really describes what actually happens to the players. He has a very proactive presence. In that way, you can have some very meaningful interactions between the player and the DM with only 2 people, and that's really cool. So while this game probably won't appeal very highly to people that are looking for that big crunchy experience, it's called crunchy, it's got lots of rules to dig your teeth into it and chew it all around. It's not that game. It's much more like Laffy Taffy. It'll stretch, it'll kind of move in ways you didn't expect it to, but in the end, it's really delicious and a wonderful experience. So, I would heavily recommend Pathfinder for new players especially, since they're probably going to be intimidated by an entire book full of rules. Especially if the people you're trying to get to play that are new players are thespians of any sort, you definitely want to go with a game like Dungeon World. If you want to buy it, it's available through Amazon and DriveThruRPG. I've put the links in the show notes, and it should be appearing on your screen right now as well. You can go to josephnewelldesign.com/natural20 for the show notes. That's Joseph, Newell design.com/natural20. Brainstorm. All right, in today's brainstorm, we're going to be talking about how to play a pen and paper game with only 2 people. Now, this is going to be a lot of guidelines and non-specifics. Just things that I have noticed while I've been playing with my wife. We have run 2 two-people games where I am the player and she's the DM, and one where I'm the DM and she's the player. So, we've been able to make it work. So I'm going to share some of the things we've been able to learn that help make the experience a lot more enjoyable. Because it can be hard, to find a full group of 5 people that can all meet at the same time in the same place and engage in a very attention-demanding activity for potentially like 4 hours at a time or more. That can be a lot to ask for. It's very possible you've only got 2 people that want to actually do it. Now, just let me say, this is possible. I have run my game with my wife for more than 6 months. And one of the first things you need to decide is who's going to be the DM. This should probably be the person with more time on their hands, as well as more confidence in being a rules monger. But even more importantly, it should definitely be the person who actually wants to do it. Whether they have a lot of time or not. The setting for 2 people needs to be very carefully considered. You can't do a typical dungeon romp and expect it to be fun. A lot of pre-written, especially many pre-written dungeons and scenarios, are designed around having lots of characters with unique abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. The thief detects traps, the fighter takes lots of damage, the wizard uses just the right spell at just the right time, and you don't have that flexibility with just one character. So let me give you an example of my wife's character. His name is Jarrett, and he is heavily involved in stealth and subterfuge and interaction with people. So those are usually the challenges he comes up against. So you really want to try and gear the challenges a lot more heavily towards the one player than you would ever in a party-filled game. Now, that doesn't mean you only give them things that they're good at. It's just like life. You have to be able to tackle things you're not good at every now and again. It keeps things interesting and varied. Jarrett has found a lot of situations where he's in combat or where he's had to deal with certain environmental hazards or ethical choices that he's not super good at. So that's a big deal. If your player is pretty new, it can be pretty intimidating being dropped into a world with potentially unlimited actions to make. Not to mention, it can be a little awkward being the focus of the entire attention span of everybody there, namely the player and the DM. So this is something you really have to read your player on. You have to ask them questions like we've talked before. Say, hey, what do you want? What do you expect? How comfortable are you with this, and this? How confident are you that you're going to be able to do what you need to do in order to, play the game naturally? Personally, I felt that with my wife, who is not a gamer, having played D&D once in her life before and, not having a lot of game experience outside of that, I felt like in this situation that a DM played character could be a good idea. Now, DM played characters where the DM actually plays a character that goes along with the party and is a member of their party. Typically, that is very highly frowned upon by more experienced DMs. However, I feel like this is a situation with an exception. Once again, going back to Jarrett had a buddy named Boris, and they grew up together in a traveling circus. And Boris was everything Jarrett wasn't. He was big and strong and dumb. And as far as the game went, his entire purpose was to be a sounding board for Jarrett. He wasn't there to fight necessarily. He wasn't there to be a character. He was there to help the main character, Jarrett, make decisions. That is why I feel in this case, this sort of thing is acceptable, because you are not taking the agency away from the player. You are helping them strengthen that muscle that allows them to think and process things in a pen and paper game and decide which actions to take. So, with a game with only 2 people, another really big thing you have to be concerned about is which rule set you use. It can be very easy to pick a rule set that, if you're not careful, will lead you to not really having a lot of interactions with each other, which will probably lead to the game being very boring. This is why I recommend games like Dungeon World and Numenera, games where the DM is very proactive in the story, to be great 2-player games, because you get that interaction between the 2 people a lot more obviously than in a game like D&D, where the DM is largely behind the scenes and reactionary. That's not to say that D&D can't be great with 2 players. If you want a really good example of how to do that, go to Dicing with Death. That's a show that Koibu does with a friend of his. Be warned, once again, everything with Koibu, there's a potential for strong language. But they make it work, and they have a cool system, and they do it. It's a lot harder though, and for new players especially, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but it is possible. Well, that's it for me here, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. Let's do a quick summary. In Expert Hearsay, we heard what Koibu had to say about player risk and how I feel he's kind of onto the right idea. Let's try and take things a little bit deeper than what they appear on the face value and curb our enthusiasm and our eagerness to be outraged. It will lead to greater understanding and some really cool insights. And that's something that can apply just to life in general. Getting all educated up in here. In our product review, we talked about Dungeon World. If you are in a group that is filled with people that really like getting into the game and role-playing and stuff, and don't really want a very crunchy game, a very rule-intensive game, Dungeon World's a great option for you. And finally, in how to play a game with only 2 people, well, make sure you've got the right person as the DM. Work hard to tailor the adventure to the player. Get a rule set that will allow the DM to be a little bit more proactive. And consider using a DM character. Get to know your player, figure out if that would be a good option. That's it for me, everybody. Thank you very much for listening to Natural 20. We will see you next time, and as always, may you roll plenty of 20s.